Félix Lorioux was born in the city of Angers, in the west of France in 1872, and as is so often the case, I can tell you nothing about his early life or family circumstances, other than that in his teens he worked as an apprentice at a stained glass company before enrolling at Paris's prestigious École des Beaux-Arts, and in 1904 he married Elisabeth Groyot. I can show you nothing at all created by Lorioux from this time, so these are all from later, but apparently following completion of his studies he worked as a draftsman for Citroën cars and left there in 1907 to work as a commercial artist with the Draeger Brothers printing house. The earliest example of his work I have managed to find is this press ad for drinking chocolate from 1911, by which time he would already have been 39 years old. A year later he created this advertising brochure published by Automobile Brassier, titled The Gospel of the Four-Leaf Clover, a reference to their emblem. And Lorioux designed and illustrated the whole brochure as a faux medieval document with considerable success. It was also in that same year that he began contributing to the covers and pages of the popular children's magazine Mon Journal, with a series of daintily evoked fairy tale images. And it was his work for this client, Hachette Publishing, with which he first established himself as a children's illustrator of note. Hachette also published books for children, and naturally enough Lorioux also became a popular choice to illustrate many of those too. The first to be published was Wonderful Tales in 1914, which consisted of reprints from the magazine. But 1914 was also the year World War I began, and although Lorioux did continue to work, it was at a much reduced rate. He illustrated this cover for the women's magazine La Vie Heureuse as the war broke out, but for the next 4 years the only other examples of his work I found was a collection of comedic spot monochromes published in the magazine Lecture pour Tout. But however modest, they demonstrated his remarkably fine and expressive pen and ink technique, and they were used to illuminate various generally light-hearted escapist articles on a range of topics. I found no more evidence of his work until 1920, when he created a couple of pochoir printed press ads for perfume, which were published in an unknown women's fashion magazine. But a year later his illustrated edition of When the Fairies Lived in France, a collection of fantasy tales written by Vivienne Ostroga, was published. And as would be the pattern for quite a few of the books he would continue to create for Hachette, the book featured full-colour page illustrations alongside numerous line-only monochromes. In 1922 he returned to the illustration of covers for Mon Journal, although this renewed association would prove to be fairly short-lived, as the magazine ceased publication not much later. In 1925 Lorioux illustrated an edition of Le Roman de Renard, rewritten from the traditional folktale by Odette Larieux. The illustrations for this book were mostly in the form of monochrome silhouettes set within the text, but there were also a few colour pages dotted throughout, featuring both human and animal characters in archetypal rural fairy tale settings. In 1926 his illustrated edition of a selection of the fairy tales of Charles Perrault was published, and from this point on decent resolution examples of his work in colour become considerably easier to locate. This was a particularly attractive and popular volume, and it was with this publication that the full aesthetic quality of Lorioux's work could be fully appreciated. For reasons I can't discover, there appear to have been two distinct editions of this book, one in monochrome with added dot screens, and the same images also reproduced as full colour. But these couple of examples aside, I'm going to focus exclusively on the more engaging colour images. There was no mystique about Lorioux's methods for colour illustration. They all had descriptive pen and ink line work as their basis, usually devoid of hatching techniques, and bright washes of watercolour were then subsequently applied to create the finished image. And in this instance at least Loriux opted to apply the colour generally flat, with only occasional minimal shading. It wasn't exclusively the case, but the colour illustrations predominantly made great use of page white, or frequently off-white, with the characters and other elements set against it with particular clarity. I'm unable to provide any conclusive information regarding his use or not of life models to inform his figure work of human characters. But despite the cartoon nature of many of the figures, there are others which seem to me to be too well observed to be totally the work of imagination. Similarly, the period costumes and other props that featured in this extensive series were surely too plausible to be the work of imagination alone. The popular success of this book had a powerful positive impact on Lorioux's career, and he swiftly followed this success with another in 1927, Les Fables de La Fontaine. These stories were essentially the original fables attributed to the ancient Greek slave Aesop, but in the later 17th century Jean de La Fontaine rewrote them in verse in French, and somewhat egotistically retitled them after himself. If anything, Lorioux's colour images for this book were even more striking and impressive than the previous year's Perrault stories, and they were certainly rendered in much finer detail. Because so many of these fables used animal characters to make their moralistic point, this book gave him the perfect opportunity to demonstrate a pronounced affinity for anthropomorphic character work that few others could hope to equal. Unlike others among his contemporaries, there was no blocking in of large background areas or variance in the level of detail applied to all the pictorial elements. And the consequence was that every image had a jewel-like clarity and uniformity of visual impact. In quite a few of the images he produced for this project, Lorieux also made considerable use of the device of allowing some visual elements to protrude outside the frame. As with the Aesop originals, some of the stories did involve humans, and they were possessed of similarly attractive qualities. But it was his highly plausible anthropomorphic animals for which the book will be best remembered. A year later he returned to images of humans with an illustrated edition of Molière's 17th century comedy play Le Malade Imaginaire, rewritten in story form, with a collection of deadpan comedic images which once again placed his characters generally in framed white space and only a minimum of background elements and props. Whether it was aimed at children I couldn't say, but Lorioux's light comedic narrative images would have certainly been equally appealing to more mature readers. And in 1930 Lorieux created a similarly humorous collection when he took on Miguel Cervantes' story Don Quixote in an edition from Hachette. This book was certainly abridged and rewritten with younger readers in mind, but this series of visually pleasing and thoughtfully constructed colourful page illustrations was a collection more than capable of striking a chord with the child in anyone. It seems he was particularly prolific with literary classics at this time because 1930 was also the year his visualisation of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe was also published. And as always, his illustrations were every bit as crucial to the book's success as the written text, and arguably more so, even if this series lacked the humour found elsewhere in his output. In 1931 he illustrated the Comtesse de Segur's story Les Deux Nigauds, or The Two Fools in English, originally written in the 1860s, and he produced a series of engaging comedic colour illustrations satirising human folly and the humorous consequences which inevitably follow. 1932 saw the publication of Silver Tales of My Grandmother, part of a series of several which had been published earlier with the illustrations of Maurice Berty. But in this year Lorieux was given the commission, and with material tailor-made for his light romantic touch, he produced yet more engrossing monochrome and full-colour fantasy images. And a year later Hachette published another fantasy story for children illustrated by Lorieux. The Golden Keys, written by Paul Gazelle, provided him with the opportunity to play to his narrative strengths and penchant for delicate evocative subject matter. With a pretty and good-natured young female protagonist and plenty of humorous animal characters in support. Lorieux had earlier met Walt Disney on one of his visits to Paris, and this led to a tentative association which included the illustration of some of Disney's Silly Symphonies animations. Among them was a reimagining of the film about Noah's Ark published in 1934, but the constraints placed on Lorieux to pay lip service to more overtly Disney styling of the period wasn't a good fit for him, and the relationship was discontinued soon after. Somewhat ironically, Lorioux would be one of the stylistic influences on Disney's later production of Snow White, his first feature-length animation. This was followed by a biographical portrayal of King Francois I, a rather atypical and graphically restrained Lorioux project, for which I found very little evidence, but which doesn't seem to have been much more than a contractual obligation for Lorioux. And in 1937, Pearl Tales of My Grandmother, the next in the series, was also published. Like the earlier book, the text consisted of rewrites and reimaginings of tales from all manner of sources, and Lorioux could be more than relied on to bring them to visual life for his young readers. In 1939, Germany and France were again at war, and it seems the subsequent occupation put an end to Lorioux's work for a few years at least. But in 1943 he met and established a meaningful working relationship with the publisher Etienne Marcus. And this resulted in a series of books for children under the broad collective title Le Buffon des Enfants. They featured remarkably detailed and aesthetically appealing colour images by Lorioux and text by Bernard Roy. There were 5 in the collection, and they were loosely based on the work of the 18th century naturalist Georges-Louis Leclerc, the Count of Buffon, hence the name. But where the Count's work had been academically serious, these books were anything but. Not only did this immense collection more than live up to the standards of his earlier work, it could be argued that it was in fact his crowning achievement, and certainly the equal of anything he had produced to date. For reasons I can't imagine, the great majority of illustrations I found from this collection were from the volume dedicated to insect life, and while I would have been happier if I could have been more diverse in my choice of images, they are nevertheless a clear demonstration of Lorioux's relentless talent for light comedic expression and anthropomorphic character creation. And every one of these fascinating illustrations defied the young reader to turn the page until all the details of a particular scene had been appreciated. But alongside the more comedic antics depicted, there were other examples from others in the series which opted to be more straightforward but still charming evocations of the subjects, as in the examples from the volume about birds of the countryside. And this significant undertaking kept him purposefully occupied throughout the years of the German occupation and in the years following France's liberation in 1944. Every source I could find asserts that 1947 was the year of publication for Jade Stories of My Grandmother, the last in this series of books. I'm not entirely convinced that this wasn't a reprint given the years of publication of the others, but as I found no evidence of this, I'll go with the flow despite my misgivings. But of course, whenever they were created, they were every bit as engaging as the others, whether created in line only or with his usual bright washes of watercolour. But the book The Vigil of Jean-Francois was definitely published in 1947. I haven't read the book, but the disparate nature of the images created by Lorioux and my translation of some of the text passages suggests that this was most likely a series of varied fantasies created by the imagination of the eponymous boy Jean-Francois. But whatever it was about, it was another resounding popular success, which was also reprinted several times. It's recorded that Lorioux continued to work up to the end of his life, but following these books from 1947, virtually all I could find were reprints of earlier successes, with just a handful of other apparently new images from the 1950s for unknown publications. And FELIX LORIOUX died in Paris in 1964 at the age of 92, but was buried in Angers, the town of his birth. Following his death, his books continued to be reprinted, and in 1971 his original illustrations of birds created for Le Buffon were even repackaged with sound recordings. Like his countryman and contemporary Edmond Dulac, Félix Lorioux was undoubtedly one of the finest and most expressive fairy tale and fantasy illustrators France ever produced. But because Dulac had left his country to work for the burgeoning British market and subsequently the USA, he has a far more significant presence in the collective consciousness. If Lorioux's work is on show in any French museums or galleries, I've been unable to find out which, and I suspect he has largely fallen through the cracks even in France, But there seems to be a reasonable amount of his original painted work for sale on auction sites, so if you find yourself with more money than you know what to do with, you might consider a purchase. But for the rest of us, we'll have to settle for them on screen, in what I like to think of as the People's Gallery.